and then I'll introduce everybody and talk about our topic, and off we'll go.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining our BrandQ webinar today, and thanks for all the attendees and certainly our panelists today. We talk about coating and lamination, finishing process, and the effect on color. This is an enormously important topic that it comes up all over the world in regards to the dramatic effect that these processes have on color. I was on a phone call this morning in Europe for an hour about this very thing, and a lot of times with brands and service providers, this communication, there's a tremendous breakdown and in regards to the starting process and the finishing process of what the expectations are. And today's webinar will shed a lot of light on how to get there and what's being produced and what the processes and effect are. So with that, I'll hand it back to Ron, but thank you for joining us. We'll take questions at the end, and we'll proceed.
Yeah, great. So welcome everybody to our BrandQ webinar. I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll get right to our speakers and get into the content here. So first, you were just listening to Tim Beckley. He's the CEO of Idealliance. He's an ISO expert, lots of experience with print, and pretty good strategic thinker. And topics like this we've noticed are really valuable for people because people are struggling with this all the time. My name is Ron Ellis. I'm a consultant, chair of print properties, and a G7 trainer. I work probably a third of my time with brands, a third with printers, and a bunch of work with Idealliance too. Our presenters today, we have Jason Campbell, and Jason, I said this makes you look way too much like an adult, but but anyway, this is Jason. He's solution architect for X-Rite, and he gets to do a lot of different things. So he's done quite a bit of software development. He was originally a programmer for Spot On, does a lot with X-Rite, has a really good brain for this type of stuff, and this topic is a great one for you, Jason. Next is Javier Robles from INX. He's Director of Tech Services at INX Inc. He's also a G7 expert trainer. And same thing, deals with ink and coating and the effect and getting that final effect, and great experience, especially from the technical ink side. Because a lot of times when this issue comes up, it comes back to what can your ink company do to help you. Next is Dave Hunter, which many of you guys probably already know from Chroma Checker and Pilot Marketing. And Dave's been around doing this for a long time as well, and his software has quite a bit of information, and he's going to show a little bit about his kind of strategy for dealing with this. So 3 very experienced guys. It's going to be a really good presentation today. Before we get started, I'm going to talk just a little bit about BrandQ, which is what sponsors this. It's our Idealliance program for brands and working with brands in the print supply chain. The big ideas behind it are communicate, educate, and validate. We have education, which are training classes that we do a lot of times custom for brands and sometimes public. But this is where we teach print buyers how to talk the language of color and print. And you can see in this room here, this is one of our classes. It's a bunch of print buyers right there, and they're all learning how to measure and learn how to talk and ask for what they need. Communicate, we're also building that communication chain between the supply chain and the brand so they know what to ask for and how to ask for it. Again, in our class here, there's people working through this right now. And then validate, and we have a BrandQ certified supply chain program, which some very large brands use, also a G7 expert program. And we teach brands as well how to actually qualify and onboard and validate suppliers. So that's the BrandQ program. If you go to the Idealliance website, it has online version of the training as well as listings of upcoming trainings. The most recent one that we had, most recent class was in Taiwan. This was last week, and you can see there's a whole bunch of people who went through this so they can work on the supply chain. And we've had classes pretty much all over the place, so all over the world, and have them upcoming as well. Many of our classes are custom, so if you're a brand, we actually go in and work right with the brand with a custom training. So this topic today, and if you have questions, send them through the chat box. But the topic that we have today is coating and how it affects color, lamination, final print process. So this is probably one of the biggest questions that I get from my customers when they're starting to do color compliance and doing brand color. In North America, largely, many of these processes are in line, so less of an issue here because when it comes off the press, it may have it. But I noticed in other parts of the world, in India, Asia, Pakistan, and even in the U.S. and Europe, there's people doing offline process, meaning they're laminating or coating offline. And, of course, the big concern there is we give the color spec to the printer. They get that spec. They print wet, meaning coming off the press, they print to those numbers, but then when it gets laminated or coated, everything shifts. Now, there's ways to deal with this and ways to compensate for it, and that's what we're talking about today. But if I look at print buyers, and one of their number one questions that I have, especially ones who are doing lamination on something or doing any type of UV or extreme coating, is, how do we get that printer to understand how to make that final product be the right color? Not when it's coming off the press, but the final product. So that's what we're going to talk about today. A lot of this happens with calibration, meaning we calibrate with the lamination. If I was printing on plastic with a credit card, I might actually print it, have one set of numbers for the press and another set of numbers for final product, and have to make that calculation. But these guys will talk about that. So we calibrate, we profile, we use all sorts of tools to do it. And with that, I'm going to move back to Jason, and we'll start with Jason. And Jason, you're up. It's your time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ron. Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have any super fancy slides or videos or any, interesting audio-visual stuff to go along. But what I can share is from some experience, as you said, Ron, when we work with customers in our respective engagements, one of the things that comes up pretty much more often than not, and a lot of my focus is on the flexo side, so lamination, is, we have a customer that specifies a shelf color. So it's what they want at the end of the day, no matter what that structure is, whether it's, reverse on clear surface print, laminated, wedged between two pieces of film and then laminated to metal. All of these different things shift color in different ways. And so, we've tried different strategies out there, and probably the most challenging is the fact that the majority of flexibles printers are printing in and to get some terminology here, we don't say unlaminated, we say pre-laminated, because, unlaminated is kind of its own different thing. And that's the condition that's on press. It might be printing reverse backed by white, but this is the operation that's occurring on press. And obviously, to deliver quality product, every one of these printers is going and they're measuring this to maintain their process while they're actually doing the print production component. In some cases, the lamination step might be done in line, which greatly simplifies things, but I would say that that's more often than not the exception and not the rule. And the lamination component might not even occur in the same facility or might even happen some days later. So there's a tremendous disconnect in the process between what the customer expectation is when the final thing goes out the door and that print production that's happening right there at that point. And this affects everything, not just in terms of the print production and the operation of the press, but even when trying to do an ink match in an ink room. And I'll let Javier speak to that because I'm sure his team faces that quite often. But the one strategy that I would offer that I've seen probably be the most reliable, not everybody embraces it, but is the use of a hand laminator. And what I mean by that is actually trying to manage color throughout the process and paying respect to what the end result is going to be. Now, the reason I say that that's not necessarily super popular is, well, first there's, obviously some cost associated. We have to put laminators in the ink room, laminators in the press room. have the appropriate materials available to mimic the final structure of that print. But if you think about it conceptually, you are, in effect, proofing what that final process is going to yield when the real production lamination occurs. Now, you might say, well, you said proofing. That makes me think profiling. Maybe there's is there some sort of magic mathematical attack to this? And I would share that we've actually tried that. And I tell you, if I could ever crack that one, I'm going to buy an island somewhere, because it's the answer everybody would love to have. But the one thing that we found in research is that not only do the different structures behave differently, and by that I mean, how we're assembling that final laminated, product at the very, very end of the process, but it even can vary by color, formulation, what kind of vehicle is in it, what kind of ink system it is it nitrocellulose? Is it something different? It's not a very symmetrical, well-behaved, predictable thing. You can do this for maybe one or two or a few colors, but to say I have a general approach to it, there's really, as of yet, no sort of magic bullet that solves this for printers. So, currently, really, the one thing that I say in terms of best practices, and just from the experience that we have had, and by we, I mean my colleagues at X-Rite that interface with customers and work on these challenges, is to say, okay, well, can we entertain the concept of hand lamination? Can we entertain the concept of managing to that final structure? And I would be remiss if I didn't call out also if there's, maybe an overprint varnish or a special effect, ink, if you will, a coating really has to play a role in the same thing. So it's not just the lamination, but also if there's, maybe a matting out applied to it, a matting, or any other kind of special effect, all of these things really need to be mimicked to try to manage and make your measurement match up to what that customer is holding you to. And as Idealliance goes with their BrandQ messaging, we go with our brand messaging, and any of us in that space working with brands and customers to manage what their expectations are, we talk to them about that. As you pointed out, Ron, this is the challenge they have, because they hear about the struggles from their print partners and their suppliers, but at the end of the day, they really need that to be on shelf consistently. And so the best strategy is really to try to manage it as close to that, end goal as possible throughout the process. And really anything short of that is kind of shortchanging and subverting all of the color measurement and all of the management that we put into place and invest in, because really you can't really trust. I've seen some people say, I've got a laminated standard, the customer approves it, and behind the scenes, the graphics coordinator has the pre-laminated one that went along with it. So, they did an ink drawdown, they did it all at the same time. They created some that were laminated, sent it to the customer to say, this is what you're going to get, Mr. Customer. And then when that gets approved, great. Here, I've got this sample that I can just run this on press. The problem with that is that then you're really trying to just trust that there is nothing varying elsewise in the process, that running that pre-laminated color standard really then duplicates and mirrors your entire color library, and at the end of the day is not actually what you should be managing, because that's not the color that's truly going out the door. So I know that was kind of a bit much of a run through, but hopefully at least sort of sets the stage for the rest of the conversation today in terms of kind of the key challenges, and at least from our point of view, the recommendations that we sort of present and offer to customers to consider to manage that end shelf color result.
Yep, and a couple things that thoughts that triggered on my end, which first one is, even with lamination, like a brand may be going out there and when they're in that part of the world where they have a delta E that's maybe like a 1.5 or a 2 delta E, and then expecting the printer to manage the lamination to still get that low delta E after their final process is quite challenging. So Javier, when it comes up, you can talk about that, and you may have thoughts about that, Jason. Second thing I noticed out there is that hand lamination very often is not the exact same material, or very often doesn't give the same exact effect. So that ties into that low delta E, which probably connects to expectations. And I know that when you're configuring color cert and stuff for the brands, when you're doing flexible lamination, delta E's move up or down, or do they stay the same, Jason?
No, I mean, the expectation from the brands that we work with is it's shelf color. It really is the holy grail for them. You know, this is, you know, my equity color, and whatever that construct is in that laminated or special effect coating, whatever that final assembly is where I need to express that equity color. So when they say that delta E of 2 or 1.5 or whatever it may be, certainly we try to right size that tolerance based on what that print process is. But that is their expectation. That's the challenge. And as you said, you know, that hand lamination isn't necessarily exactly the same as production level lamination. But what I have found is that you are able to usually, you know, some may shortcut it, but for it to work at all successfully, it really does need to be those same materials. So if I go to a plant that, you know, maybe their primary structures are, you know, 4 or 5 main structures that they produce at that plant, perhaps laminated to foil, laminated to clear poly, is to have those very same materials. And most critically, weird technical thing, is that it really is that same material used in production, meaning the same, you know, extrude, you know, lamination adhesive, because that in itself can change things. So if I go from one adhesive to another, the change from pre-laminated to laminated is not always uniform.
All right, looks like I'm up.
Let's move over to you, Javier. And the question that we just went through, you know, the brand wants 1.5 delta E, which is hard enough on unlaminated sometimes, and then you're adding in that lamination. How do you guys deal with that? And you can answer that at any point. I know you probably have things you want to talk about.
Well, I mean, I'll start with saying that our experience is pretty much follows along the same lines as what Jason expressed. We have done a lot of testing on trying to figure out math on how to calculate these changes, and without a lot of success. I mean, we'll see sometimes a coating or a lamination might move your DE 0.5 point. Sometimes it'll do 4 or better. And it really does vary depending on the hue of the color, the chroma of the color. We see some patterns, but nothing that's really super predictable. So the only way we can deal with it is in much the same fashion. You try to duplicate the finished product. You add the matte coating or the gloss coating or the lamination, and we really do insist on showing drawdowns proofs with no process and then with the finishing, so that they can see what it's going to look like when you're making ready, before you add the final finishing, and then after the fact. So that's really the only way we've found to deal with it. And even then, you've got some things that are difficult to control. For instance, we can do a drawdown with a UV gloss or UV matte coating, but the dwell time, and it's a small thing, the dwell time between the time we print a swatch on a Little Joe manage to apply a coating with an analog coater and run it through a UV curing unit is much, much longer than the time it would take to do it on press. That affects the way that the coatings level out, affects the gloss, matte levels, which in turn has an effect on the final appearance. So even as hard as we try to mimic the actual press conditions, we still have some variation. So it's a really hard thing to do. And that's just, I think, what the only real strategy is to communicate very effectively with the brands to let them know what these challenges are, record a lot of data, and try to learn from each run and record data, and we will tailor our process. For instance, when we do the first set of drawdowns and then the press run goes on, and even, you know, if the job is approved and we're within tolerance delta E, we'll still go back and see what can we do in our lab now to make that proof look more the way the actual job was printed on press. So it's a constant manipulation. It's constantly working and adjusting the conditions under which the drawdowns and proofs and colors are matched to try and achieve that goal of matching the end product as closely as possible or representing that.
Yep. Have you used any of the programs that have you do wet-dry calculations and found any of that stuff helpful?
We have, and actually it's helpful in a lot of cases. Where it really doesn't help us is in, you know, the usual suspects, violets, fluorescents, metallics. Those continue to be wildly unpredictable. You know, in the case of UV curing, which is very popular, just the amount of UV energy you apply, you can change the color of a fluorescent just by taking the lamp up 10%. So, you know, so you've got that challenge happening at the same time. How if you're pinning inks, if you're not pinning inks, there's just so many things we can do to move that color easily within a DE, just on how things are applied, how the adjustments are made on press, your choice of colors. I mean, again, yellow, we find that yellows don't get moved around a lot by just about anything you do to them. But rubines, you know, those type of red family, we see huge swings just with AQ coating. So there's a lot of variables that determine how big of a shift you're going to see. What we do know is that you will see a shift. And what we think is always prudent is not to guess, to try and mimic the process using, for instance, the hand laminator or applying the UV coating or the aqueous coating, and whenever possible, the actual coating, not just some, you know, random lab sample. We will try to apply the exact same coating that's going to be used on the job. Because, of course, if one coating is more matte than the other, you have a different effect.
Right. So the coating seems successful, right, when you're applying the actual coating. But a lot of the hand lamination samples I've seen, this is my own experience, look pretty shaky as far as not being correctly adhered. And I don't know if you run into that, but that seems like a much more difficult.
It is much more difficult, absolutely. We have more predictability with the coatings, especially the water-based coatings. It gets a little trickier with UV because of flow out and things like that. And then it gets really tricky with satin and matte coatings. Yeah. That's when it's pretty tough to mimic.
Let's see. And then as far as the Delta E's, the customers, you're in printing plants trying to match these all the time. The Delta E's that a brand asks for in this laminated type product and what they really get, what are your feelings about that, or gut feelings, or what do you see?
Well, when they come out of our ink room, our customers are asking us for 0.7 DE or better, right, from our drawdowns. I think most of the printers are shooting for a 2 or better. I think very few are successful at that. And more are unsuccessful than are willing to admit it.
I have that feeling because from watching this, watching brands ask for this and go out there, until they start to measure and check, and Dave, you can talk about this because you've got a lot of data, but until they start to measure and check, I think they tell the printer, 2 or 1.5. The printer does their best, but if they're not measuring and checking, then, like you said, I think very few are actually achieving it in lamination and offline coating.
Right, and we're afraid to admit it because they're afraid, that the other printer will say, oh, hell, no problem, we'll do that. And we've, gone out, we're curious, we go out in the store shelf, buy some, bring it back to our lab and see how it really ended up. And I think more times than not, they're not. Is intolerance that they believe that they are in.
Yeah, no, I sense that as well because I noticed that being in a lot of printing plants, watching them attempt it, there's a limit to what they can do and still produce the product, and that part seems really disheartening. But it's important for the brand to know where it really can go, what the limit is, I think.
Absolutely, and just to increase that communication, and more than anything, allow the time to do a little trial and error on the proofing process, whether it ink drawdowns or proofs or what have you, to try and perfect that process as much as possible, because it's not something people want to spend a lot of time on. The job move their way through a printing plant fairly quickly. People tend to kind of say, well, we're close, it'll look okay, let's go for it. So and then you feel really great about we nailed the DE on the ink part of it, right? We're a 0.5 DE, but we're kind of fooling ourselves and making ourselves feel good about it. But then we go off to the finishing part of it, and it goes its own way.
Yeah. And the other part that I noticed. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's a really
good thing. And again, we'll especially see that again on the usual type of colors, the violets, the metallics, the pastels, especially pastels as well. Well, you'll really see those dramatic effects that really start to throw it quite a noticeable amount out of tolerance.
Yeah, because one other observation I have is when I go into a supply chain, there might be, say there's 10 printers and 3 of them have inline coating or lamination. Those guys can nail it because they can see exactly what's happening, and the other 7 can't touch it. But for the brand, they can't really limit that supply chain to only the guys who have inline.
One thing that that we see, globally, and everybody sees globally, is that the unique part of packaging is certainly a product within itself, and a lot of times you see what's inside of the package might be a lower cost product, but has a very, very high end packaging. Might be a poly with reverse, with the backing, with a laminate, but a very low cost product inside. Then you have the adverse to that is you have a very high end, very expensive product, but with a packaging to it that is very, very nice, but not very complex. So from a design standpoint, if you're starting with there, it makes you think about, from a designing standpoint, what is achievable in cost, and driving that down too, of getting to, simplicity, cost, and achievability, driving that scenario as well.
Yeah, for the brand, that's important, because a lot of this, like if somebody has Javier or a company like that can come in, then they've got resources. But some of the places that around the world that things go to don't have their own ink labs and don't have ink support near them, and those printers seem to have a really hard time with this.
Yeah, I've walked into plants where they just don't have anything.
Yeah,
right, and they have no, and what's worse, they don't have no relationship with their supplier that can advise them on these kind of things. It's tough because sometimes, and I won't mention the brand, but there's a brand color where at one time we were telling one of our customers that was not finishing in line, I know that the DE is 2 points off of what you think it's supposed to be, but this is where you have to run it so that it'll end up the way it needs to end up. And that's a really tough conversation because they have to have a lot of faith in the people giving them that advice. So
Yeah.
it is not an easy thing to manage.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Javier. Next, I'll move on to Dave Hunter, and you can pass control to Dave, and then once he finishes, we'll have Q&A, and we'll run through your questions. And so, Steve, can you pass Dave control?
And we have a lot of questions poured in as well.
Oh, I'm sure we do. So, yeah. No, Dave will talk for about 15, and then we'll pop into those.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
Loud and clear.
And you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, put in presenter mode or a little bit bigger would be good, but we can see it.
okay, I'm actually showing a web page here, and it's showing a diagonal cut on each of these images of the effect of the lamination in the process, which in this example is showing an 11% change in the dot gain. And what you're seeing in the upper left side is what the file is expected to look like when it's in a G7 condition. And on the bottom right side is what the effect is after you apply matte lamination to your G7 corrected proofs or press sheets, which make the file look bad. So the trick, as everyone's discussed, is we want to back engineer the process so that when we print on our press, in this case, essentially, it would have an 11% less dot gain. So when the lamination is applied to the process, we then get the G7 compliant product the way we expect it to look. So I think that's the problem that everyone's trying to solve. And we have, using numbers and process control, we have a procedure that many people in the audience should be able to implement today using numbers. A couple things I want to stress and build on that the other speakers spoke about is process control is absolutely critical. You need to hit the same numbers that the lookup tables that I'll talk about that we use to build the back engineered process so that when I'm printing on my press, in this case with the matte lamination, it's lighter than it should be. But when it's then post laminated, the press sheet comes into G7 compliance. And so in this scenario, we'll have essentially two workflows. One workflow to show the customer what the end G7 laminated result will look like. And then one workflow that will show our operator what the press should look like before lamination. And not only what it should look like, but what his densities should be and what his dot gains should be. And if the press operator hits those densities and those dot gains, then we can be assured that when we apply the post-lamination process, the file will come into compliance for whatever standard we're looking for, which in the majority of my situations is something like Grackle and G7 tonality and gray balance. So let's talk about how we do this. And this is actually a complete how-to that is documented on all the steps to go through. And I only have 20 minutes, so I'm just going to cover the highlights, but I'll be happy to provide all the attendees of this seminar the link to this document so you can review it on your own, and feel free to ask me questions at any time now or in the future in terms of how to make this work. And in this scenario, I'm going to be talking about some specific products that do certain things, but there's other products on the market that can do similar things. I know these products, and these are the products that I'm going to talk about. But this process is not contingent on these products. All right?
Yep. And we probably have, Dave, about 10 or 11 minutes, so we have enough time for Q&A.
Okay, great. So
Perfect.
Essentially, this is a real life scenario, and I've got multiple real life scenarios that I could talk about. So, well, I've got multiple I can't because under non-disclosure and so forth, but we've applied this process for credit card companies, packaging companies, all sorts of scenarios, security cards. So it's gift cards. So it's a very, it's a proven process. It works. There's very little trial and error. And I'm really excited about it because we've had such great success. So in this scenario, this customer wanted to do this customer was willing to do a dedicated print run. And again, building off the former speakers, it's critical that you use the same materials that you're going to be using in production. It's too easy to try to use a simulated material and you will not get the same result. Different laminations have different colors and different glues, and you want to use the exact process that you're planning on working in production, which is going to cost a little bit more money up front, but it's going to save a lot more money when you actually have to reproduce this a couple 100,000 or 1,000,000 times. So here's the procedure. First thing we do is we set up our press calibration, and we essentially run our press to our standard densities and our standard dot gains in terms of, in this case, we're printing linear, is the way that this customer did it, and we're documenting how this press is printing this way. And we're looking at here how far off we are from Grackle, 6 points light on the density, 8 points heavy on the magenta. And remember, this is an average of all the ink key zones across the press. We're always going to be splitting hairs, but the beauty is, in this process, we're going to get it as close as we can here, and we can see our delta E's to Grackle are 1 and 1 and 0.3 and 2. We're going to end up making what we call an OK sheet, which is actually how that press prints, and we're going to direct that press operator to come back to hit that OK sheet in the future with these exact densities and the exact dot gains, so that there's no question about what should I be hitting, what do I need to aim for. And when you take a look at the dot gain, I want to just get on a soapbox for a second and just say that the dot gain is where all the variation happens. This is one press run over the course of 1,000 sheets, and look at the amount of variation in the black dot gain. Now, obviously, there's a slur or double going on here, and it's normal. It's what's going to happen on a press. And as much as we told the company their press issue, and we documented what the E factor was on the press, which was a 3.4 because of this variation, they weren't willing to fix it at this point, and that's okay. But you've got to understand then that that's the variation that we're going to have in the product too. So the limitation of the physical equipment will greatly affect the limitation of the final product. And a lot of times ownership doesn't understand that concept, and that's a critical concept to understand. So we get the press printing to a consistent and uniform standard, and then we iterate our plate curves in terms of how these plate curves need to be iterated in terms of hitting G7, and we get our G7 condition. Then what we do is we laminate that G7 condition, and this is where we see the dot gain changing dramatically, and in fact the densities are changing as well, of course, for the solids, and the overprints and all the other colors are changing when that lamination is applied. Now, we build a profile for both the G7 condition and the laminated condition. So now we have an ICC profile that defines the color characteristics of, in this case, the 1617 patch TC 1617 target, to understand what's going on mathematically between these two conditions. And using our profile inspector, we can show that the gamut is actually being reduced with this matte lamination, and it's causing a significant visual color shift. The E factor is a 6 different between the before and after lamination, and hence we need to be able to accommodate this. So then what we do is we set up a production procedure using a color server type application. In this case, I'm using All-in Color Hub. And All-in Color Hub, I'm setting 2 queues up. One queue for the press operator's file and proof to show the press operator what they're going to be hitting, and a second file which is actually going to be applying the back-engineered color transformation so that when this file hits plate, it's light, and when it prints, it's light, but then when it's laminated, it hits G7 compliance. And this is a trick that many people don't know, and it's I'm giving away a huge secret here, but it's going to help everyone dramatically in the way you do your process. And the trick is that we have 2 profiles. We have a post-lamination or after lamination profile and a pre-lamination profile. And in our color server, we set up 2 queues. And the first queue goes from Grackle to our after lamination conversion. And so all our customer jobs are converted through this queue to the after lamination conversion. Then we build a second queue, and we set this up so in production it's automatic. You don't even know there's 2 queues. The output of the first queue goes into the input of the second queue. And in the second queue, in the input section, even though the file was converted for an after lamination, we use the before lamination profile as the input profile. And in this way, it performs a cutback necessary in order to give us a result that when it prints, it's light, and when it's laminated, it is then correct. So it gets a little tricky here, but we've got this document for you to refer back to. And like I said, I'm using Color Hub in this scenario, but other color servers can be used in the exact same way. And then you've actually got 2 end files. One file goes to the proofer to show the press operator what he's aiming for, but remember, the press operator also has this dashboard to tell him exactly what densities and dot gains we're expecting him to hit after the G7 curves are applied. And this is another key thing that, if you're new to this, I wouldn't expect you to understand this, but it's really key to understand, is that the dot gain after the curve is applied is going to be different than the dot gain before. But our software will tell the press operator what dot gain we need the press to be at in order for this process to work. Whether you're hitting G7 or in this case, you're hitting a condition that's going to be lighter than G7, that once laminated will turn into G7. So using this process control procedure, we help the press operator see what they're going to get, and we help the customers see what they're going to get, and then we actually apply it in production. And if you're using a color server with ink reduction capability, that can help also, because it will reduce the variability and the volatility of the file. And then when you apply your curves, and in this process I outline, I talk about applying the correction curve, the tone reproduction curve within Color Hub, but you can save the curve as a color flow file or AG file and apply the curve through your normal workflow. It's really, that part is independent of the process. And then in this way, you've got the 2 proofs, one for the customer, one for the press operator, and here's the actual reproduction of these prints, so that when you print it, it will be light, but when it's laminated, it will now be G7 compliant, and the customers are just thrilled by this result. It's really key that you follow these process control procedures. And one of the things I found with lamination devices is that most lamination devices do not have an internal sensor of what the pressure is for that laminator. So I found that I use it's called a pressure indicator gauge. It has a mylar plastic electronic gauge that you can put into the laminator and actually document the exact pressure that is being applied. And ideally, you should be also looking at the temperature and document this so that you've got the press procedure down to absolute numbers and process control for your densities and your dot gains. Well, you have to do the same thing in the lamination process. You need to ensure you have the right pressures and temperature on that lamination unit so that you can get consistent and predictable results. So,
great.
Like I said, this is available for anyone who wants to access it.
Awesome. So I think, Tim, you said there's a bunch of questions flying in.
Oh, yeah, we've got loads of questions. So I'll go through as many as we can. So I'll just start with the top. So the first one, and Javier and you and Jason touched on this, but it's do you think it's feasible to anticipate such an effect on a contract-proof system without lamination on it? And the answer, you guys answered that, but a lot of brands and service providers kind of mimic this with material and substrates differentiators they lay over the top, which is certainly not the same to give them the measured results. But I don't know who wants to field that question.
Well, I guess from my perspective, we can, if the net result is the tonality and the gray balance and the appearance of what the file is going to look like, I feel we've gotten good results with this procedure that I laid out. Now, depending upon the type of lamination, if it adds kind of a color to it, again, we can simulate that color because we're building an ICC profile of that process, so we can instruct the proofer to simulate that yellowish glue on the laminate that's being applied. So from my perspective, I think you can create a very accurate proof simulating what the actual resultant press is going to provide, as long as you use process control throughout the workflow.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add to that is sometimes when you're doing this, if you're doing lamination, you need to actually change to a glossier paper than a proofing paper. So a lot of people may
like a photo paper or something like that.
Like a photo paper or something with a high gloss or luster, so they see that same appearance. And then sometimes they will flip. They may actually change their spot color to a special based on the actual output, meaning have the printer do a bunch of testing and realize they can't hit a color like Javier was saying and actually pick one that can be achieved or create a special to represent that, and then they can proof that.
Well, I want to add another add-on to all of that conversation and tagging on to Dave's run-through on that procedure. And it relates to some of the questions I've seen kind of blow by about, ECG and some other things. There's this procedure, I've seen it work, that Dave outlined. It's effective for proofing. It's effective if you're going to go 4-color process or 7-color process, because that is how all the color is being built. So when you build that profile, as Dave outlined, that pre and post lam result is what you're capturing in that characterization. I've attempted to use that same approach in an abstract model for formulated inks, so meaning formulated spots, and maybe Javier will tag on to me on this. And it kind of breaks down. The profiling process doesn't correlate really well to the behaviors on press when we say, Dave's examples, that would be our Contone imagery, our process imagery, and then let's say I have that equity color. How do I model that for, say, a target on press? And unfortunately, that's where the math and the technology sort of falls into a crack because that formulated color behaves different than the profile does on process.
That's right,
Yeah.
Jason. So that's almost a separate calculation, and wet dry calculation that's separate from the CMYK.
Absolutely, and so it gets more difficult the more universal you try to make it, right? So if I'm running it a customer and I know their process, they have a certain type of oven, they have a certain dwell time, a certain temperature, so that's going to affect the pigment one way. And then you move a mile down the road and they've got more modern equipment, less dwell time, less temperature. So now I'm seeing effects of ink, ink being moved by the temperature of the process, by exposure of the energy when it's being cured. Then on top of that, you add the coatings and how they're affected. And so then it starts to break down, like you guys mentioned.
Well, that's why process control is so critical. But hey, bringing on your points, guys, I haven't had the opportunity to do this, but I would think it would work very well, is doing a CXF X4, printing over white, printing over black, and applying it to this process. I would think using that level of math, we could make it predictable in terms of the effect of the post-lamination process on custom colors.
It is once recorded.
I would agree with that.
Yeah,
I would agree with that. Recorded. I think you probably could. Yeah, it would just be like you said. You'd have to gather the data, get as much input, and control the process as quickly as well as possible.
Yeah, I have customers doing wet dry calculations in software on Spot and brand colors, and it works as long as, like Dave says, the process control is stable. As long as everybody knows where they have to go to get there.
Or we just print everything ECG and be done.
Yeah. Well, even then, lamination.
Forget the formulated inks.
You'll get a lot of ink manufacturers. You'll get a lot of ink manufacturers that will agree with that. That will support that. Yeah, absolutely.
But if I can jump in here, yes, I totally agree that with extended gamut inks and so forth, that's great. But people somehow think that they don't need process control so much when they do extended color ink, and oh my goodness, if you can't print 4-color, forget about even trying to print 7-color, because that accentuates the variables by almost 100%. So yes, ECG is fantastic, but you gotta get your process control right if you're even going to attempt to do ECG.
Yeah, they call it process sprint. That means you got to control the process.
Yeah. So
Tim, can you move to the next?
Yep, we've done it. Yeah. We've got 8 minutes left, and we've got a number of questions. So if we can shorten up the responses, that would be, so we get through all these, that'd be great.
You mean
the next question
yes
is
and no?
No, I mean, I really like to make sure we can answer as many of these questions as possible. So should we send 2 different proof controls to the printer? Such as one to the press operators during the run, and then another one to the final stage when it comes time to laminate.
That is our
and assuming the we in that means the printer, not the brand.
Yeah, it would be. I assume this means coming from the brand to the service provider.
That would be hard. Other way around would probably work.
Yeah, I mean, most brands and all these PQMs are really looking at their shelf color and managing the shelf color. Every printer and every process and every ink system is going to have its own nuances. So that's really got to, like Ron said, it's really got to live with the printer and be managed internally.
Yep.
Okay. Next, another question was, does heat play a role in changing colors, such as first 10 minutes of lamination versus over a half hour? I think, Ron, you kind of talked about that.
Yeah, and I think, Javier, you were talking to that in your section about how that changes the UV lamps and everything.
Yeah, and even the lamination, and we deal with especially the credit card printers and that kind of thing. So you will see that temperature change colors over time, especially the reds.
Yep. Great.
So again, it all comes down to process control, right? Do it the same every time, and then
Yep.
you can have some predictability. Yeah.
So there was, I'm piecing together this question. So for less critical clients, and this is about finding a good silver bullet. For example, with soft touch lamination, we see that if we lighten the dot by 5% on our digital press and maybe take a little bit of yellow out, it looks okay. Wondering your thoughts. Not certain of the. I think maybe they're lightening based upon the final effect or getting to the final effect, perhaps.
That's a tough one. Probably not enough information to
Yeah, it
respond.
kind of sounds like a trial and error type thing, and they're doing a manual cutback, and they're getting something that's reasonable, and that's how most people do it if they don't have the numeric tools to do it right, or precisely, I should say. So, not enough information.
As another question is, as a brand owner, would it be easier to manage brand consistency by having my printers go to an expanded gamut specification versus trying to manage spot color for all different printers and structures? Which I know that every person on this phone can answer that question. I'm going to repeat it. As a brand owner, would it be easier to manage brand color consistency? So as a brand owner,
I would think I think it would be yes.
Well, I guess my reply is if the printer can print 7-color. I've seen so many printers try to print 7-color and they can't because they can't even print 4-color, and then the brand gets frustrated because they don't get the consistency that they were hoping to get, and they go back to spot. So,
yep, that's a fair point, Dave. I think that's really I want to emphasize and kind of ride your tail on that point. Is that's a loaded answer. If your supplier is an experienced ECG 7-color printer that has process control in place and can demonstrate consistency and has expertise in that, they can by all means deliver excellent, consistent results versus the faced challenge of lots of different ink systems and matching custom colors. That removes that variable, but Dave's point is absolutely critical.
Right. Yep. And the lamination is still a challenge, even with 7-color encoding.
But it can be modeled, and that's, I think, the key thing is Dave's process that he outlined there. Because it's a process and because all your color is being generated in that same color model and system, it's a lot more reliable than throwing an arbitrary formulated ink through some kind of math like that, which as of yet, every attempt and I've gotten some pretty crazy attempts, some pretty crazy math, there's no magic bullet.
Yeah, and I'll leave this. We'll have the last question here. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of them, but here's the last one, and we'll wrap up. Can cold laminating help with color accuracy?
I think you still have similar issues even with cold laminating.
Okay, well, maybe we have time for one more then.
Yeah.
So I'd expect it to be the same.
Yeah. So let's go with this last one then. So do I need my operator to measure 2 different samples, one unlaminated for process and another laminated sample for spot colors? Or can I just laminate and always check back to lamination? Customer requires laminated data.
Yeah. I think it's much like Dave said, it's process control. Whatever those numbers are that we can verify gives you the result laminated, they need to be at those pre-lam numbers for both.
Well, I want to add to that because I think I get the gist of that question is you know, when we do those brand, whether it's any of our solutions or any of our entities and our engagements with brand customers, they want that spot, their equity colors being managed on any reporting or any brand quality reporting that's being done. And a lot of times the measurements being done are in that pre-lam state. You know, so there's that gap as well where, you know, they want reporting on what's going out the door, not necessarily your process. And that adds just a little more complexity.
Yeah, a lot of some of the solutions out there that do the wet dry back calculations, they will base the wet score on the final, you know, what the dry or finish would be. So the brand would be having the customer or having the supplier read it wet, but scoring it as though the, you know, what the calculation says will happen to the finished product.
Well, I want to say thank you to everyone first that joined and signed up for this this webinar. We had, I think, close to or over 300 people from around the world, and I greatly appreciate especially the panelists and their time and information. And as always, Ron Ellis, for your leadership and time and putting these great topics together and information to the world. We'll send out this webinar recording sometime this afternoon, so everybody has it to the world, and you'll also see it on LinkedIn. But thank you so much. I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend, and we greatly appreciate your time and support of the industry.
Great. Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.